Good evening. My name is Felicia Salinas Moniz. I'm the director of the Sarah Doyle Center for Women and Gender here at Brown, and I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to the Masha Dexter Lecture on Gender, Sexuality, and Public Policy's presentation of Let the People Vote, a conversation on voter rights and suppression. Before we begin, I would like to share Brown University's land acknowledgement. Brown University is located in Providence, Rhode Island, on lands that are within the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. We acknowledge that beginning with colonization and continuing for centuries, the Narragansett Indian tribe have been dispossessed of most of their ancestral lands in Rhode Island by the actions of individuals and institutions. We acknowledge our responsibility to understand and respond to those actions. The Narragansett Indian tribe, whose ancestors stewarded these lands with great care, continues as a sovereign nation today. We commit to working together to honor our past and build our future with truth. Tonight's event is made possible through a generous donation from the family of Masha Dexter. The purpose of the fund and of the lectureship is to memorialize and promote in other students Masha Dexter's extraordinary energy and engagement with the overlapping issues of gender, sexuality, and public policy, as reflected in the broad range of her own activities. Masha was active in planning the LGBTQ Center. She was also active in the Queer Alliance, the Sarah Doyle Center, Students for Choice, and the American Civil Liberties Union. Masha was a writing fellow, a teaching assistant in economics, and a Meiklejohn advisor. An economics concentrator, she was also a talented writer, an outspoken feminist, an engaged activist, a spirited debater, and an ardent friend. Her commitment to the principles of equality and justice in society were equal to her commitment and love for friends from all places and of all ages. This evening's program is also co-sponsored by the Brown Center for Students of Color, Brown Votes, the Democracy Project, the LGBTQ Center, the Sarah Doyle Center's Gender Equity Series, the A. Alfred Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy, and there will be time at the end for audience Q&A. And for those who've received copies of our speakers' books, there will also be time at the end for a book signing. And now I'd like to share a little bit about our esteemed speakers this evening. Gilda R. Daniels is a professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law. She is a former deputy chief in the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Voting Section. She also served as a litigation director at Advancement Project National Office, supporting the Justice, Education, Immigrant Rights, and Voting projects, a staff attorney at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and is currently a consultant at the Campaign Legal Center. Professor Daniels is a nationally recognized voting rights and election law expert. She has investigated, negotiated, and litigated cases involving the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the National Voter Registration Act, and other voting statutes. She teaches election law, appellate advocacy, federal courts, civil procedure, and critical legal theory, which includes jurisprudence, critical race theory, socioeconomics, and access to justice. Professor Daniels is the author of Uncounted, The Crisis of Voter Suppression in America. Ms. Magazine called Uncounted required reading. Starred Book List said that it provides a roadmap and a valuable resource for all participants in civic life. She has drafted and participated in amicus briefs filed in the United States Supreme Court on various civil rights and constitutional issues, frequently consults on voting rights cases, and is well published. Her scholarship focuses on the intersections of race, law, and democracy. Her law review articles have appeared in the California Law Review, George Washington Law Review, among others, and her writings have also been published in print media outlets and quoted in the national press, including Washington Post and NPR's All Things Considered. Juliette Hooker is the Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence in Political Science here at Brown University, where she teaches courses on racial justice, Black political thought, Latin American political thought, democratic theory, and contemporary political theory. Before coming to Brown, she was a faculty member at the University of Texas at Austin. She is the author of multiple award-winning books, including Race and the Politics of Solidarity, Theorizing Race in the Americas, Douglas, Sarmiento, Du Bois, and Vasconcelos, Black Grief, White Grievance, The Politics of Loss, and editor of Black and Indigenous Resistance in the Americas, From Multiculturalism to Racist Backlash. Theorizing Race in the Americas was awarded the American Political Science Association's 2018 Ralph Bunche Book Award for Best Work in Ethnic and Cultural Pluralism and the 2018 Best Book Award for the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics section, and Black Grief, White Grievance was awarded the 2024 Best Book Award of the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics section of the American Political Science Association, and was a finalist for the Prose Award in Government and Politics from the Association of American Publishers in 2023, a Library Journal Best Social Science Book of the Year, and a Seminary Co-op Notable Book of the Year. Thank you both for being here this evening, and now I would like to turn it to Professor Hooker to get us started.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, both to be in collaboration with the Sarah Doyle Center and also to be having this very important conversation, given where we are at the moment, with such a brilliant scholar, Professor Gilda Daniels, who has both written about, but also practiced in the area of election law, and so brings deep knowledge and experience to this conversation. So I'm going to begin by, we're going to have a conversation and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And of course, for the lucky first 15 who came, you get to have copies of the books, so that's wonderful. So I'm going to begin by asking about the fact, voter suppression is once again top of the news, given the upcoming presidential election, as attempts by particularly Republican elected officials at the state level to make it more difficult for their citizens to vote, make it clear that for some, the route to winning elections is not by persuading majorities of voters, but by restricting the electorate. For example, SB 1 in Texas, enacted in 2021 under the guise of election integrity, made it more difficult for voters to receive assistance registering and mailing their ballots. It also criminally restricted how paid canvassers can engage with voters in the presence of a mail-in ballot and has been called voter suppression legislation. In states such as Alabama and North Carolina, we also have false assertions of voter fraud being used to remove qualified voters from the voter rolls by the thousands. Your book, Uncounted, which you can see over there, traces the history of voter suppression in the U.S. Can you begin by telling us what the true history of voting in the U.S. has been, and what are some common misconceptions about that history?
All in about 5 minutes, right? Exactly. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. I told the class earlier, I'm from Louisiana, so when you say good evening, I'm also the daughter and granddaughter of Baptist preachers. So we believe in call and response. So hopefully there'll be a little call and response. So certainly while Professor Hooker and I are here having a conversation, that you all are very much part of that conversation as well. So I've wrote Uncounted, The Crisis of Voter Suppression, and it was published in 2020. I wrote the book because I felt like there were some missing pieces. I don't know if, when I grew up, I liked to play with these, it was a connect the dots page. It was just numbers on a page, and you would have to connect the dots from 1 to 2 to 3, right? So for people who actually use paper, I noticed the old people in the room, right? Everyone else is digital, but you would connect the dots, and I loved playing those games. And I realized one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was because I wanted to connect the dots for everyone else in regards to the true history, I call the true history of voting in these United States of America. And we have quite what I call a paradoxical democracy. From the outset, in regards to apportionment and representation, our country began by saying that certain people would have the full rights of citizenship. And then for purposes of representation, when using the 3/5 compromise, we decided that certainly enslaved persons would be counted as less than full beneficiaries of citizenship. Right? So for purposes of determining how many representatives a state would receive, we have the 3/5 compromise. So at one hand, it's paradoxical because while we're saying in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, right? And there's some things that are self-evident, right? And on the other hand, we're saying, but for purposes of representation, for purposes of determining who gets to access the right to vote, it's only going to be for certain types of people. And certainly from the outset of our country, those persons were white men who owned property. It's very interesting when I tell in my election law class that it wasn't even about citizenship at that time. It was who owned property and were you white and male. So very gendered, of course, right? But only those persons were able to exercise the right to vote. And it would take almost 100 years for that to change, and a civil war in order for, through the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that provided the opportunity for any country on this earth for the first time to experience a multiracial democracy, right? And so with the passage of the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which certainly we had the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment with equal protection of the law, under the law and due process. 15th Amendment said that Black men in particular could have the right to vote. So you have almost 100 years after certainly the signing of the Constitution, you have white men and Black men who can now access the right to vote. And with that, we saw in a very short period of time, because remember Reconstruction, the Reconstruction period was around 8 to 10 years. And so after the passage of those Civil War amendments, we have the ability of Black men to register and vote. And indeed they did. And they were able to elect almost 2,000 persons to state, local, and federal offices. The astonishing fact that I always point out is that in Mississippi, the state of Mississippi, now this is after Reconstruction, after the passage of the Civil War amendments, elected 2 Black men to the United States Senate during the Reconstruction period. They didn't serve at the same time, but they elected 2 Black men to the United States Senate. We didn't get 2 Black men from the South in the United States again until 2020. I am pausing for effect right here. And that's with the election of Raphael Warnock in Georgia, and you had Tim Scott in South Carolina. So you had 2 Black men who were elected from the South in the United States Senate in 2020. And 2 Black men had been elected from in essence from the same state, and you had other Black men in the Senate, but from the same state, and certainly in that period of Reconstruction. And I use that to say that's the power of the vote. That's the power of elections. And so because the Black community was so successful, and certainly finally realizing those full benefits of citizenship, and particularly the right to vote. There are 2 things, particularly after or certainly during Reconstruction, Black people were dead set on getting an education and utilizing the right to vote, right? And so they certainly did those 2 things. We can thank Reconstruction for our boards of education, right? So there are things that were certainly done during that period that we still have today. But the fact that we weren't able to elect folk from those former Confederate states until hundreds of years later, I think is telling certainly on democracy, and certainly how we see democracy. That period of Reconstruction was so short, and that period where we saw those gains was so short because of something that they're talking about in the news now that may happen, right? What if there's a tie? What if we can't determine who the president of the United States is. And they had the Hayes-Tilden Compromise after the election of 1876. And in the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, they removed the protection, meaning the federal troops, from the South. So the federal troops were enabling the newly enfranchised Black men to actually access the right to vote and get elected to local, state, and federal offices. And so once they made this compromise, that's why people say, oh, we want bipartisan decisions. I was like, I don't know about that, because whenever they make compromises, and yes, we do want bipartisanship, but I'm just like, at what cost? Certainly the Hayes-Tilden Compromise cost Black men the ability to actually access the right to vote, because they no longer had the protection of the federal government. Because we needed those federal troops to register people to vote, and as well as to provide protection, physical protection, to actually go into the polling places. Because after the Civil War, and after they had the compromise where the South had to adopt the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and remove the federal troops, guess what? That progress that had been made during the Civil War all but evaporated. In places like Louisiana, where I'm from, there were more than 100,000 Black men who were registered to vote during that period of Reconstruction, and certainly prior to 1900. After they had these state constitutional conventions to adopt the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, they also adopted grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes, voucher systems, where someone who was registered had to voucher for you, or a grandfather clause where you could vote if your grandfather was able to vote, guess what, prior to the ratification of the 15th Amendment. Guess what? That was not somebody who looked like me, right? And so those grandfather clauses, literacy tests, and other devices actually remove those Black men from the ability to register and vote. And numbers in Louisiana went from 100,000 to 1,000. In Alabama, that number went from 146,000 during that period between 1880 and 1896. And around 1902, after they had these state constitutional conventions and adopted these disenfranchising mechanisms, that number went from 146,000 to, take a guess. 46. You read my book. It was 46. 46. From 146,000 Black men registered after the grandfather clause, the literacy test, and I did not mention violence and terror, economic terrorism. You lose your land for voting. Your home is burned down for voting. You are lynched for voting. Because those federal troops are removed, those are the kinds of activities that prevented Black men from voting. In the book, I use my grandmother as the framework for the book. She was born in 1919, and she lived to be 99. And so what I found, and so certainly part of the frame for the book, is what I call these 100-year cycles, from the founding of the country to the Civil War amendments. It's about 100 years. From the Civil War amendments to the Voting Rights Act, it's about 95 years. It's another 100 years. And now we're from the Voting Rights Act to we're 60 years in. So you're talking about, in regards to where we are, we're just at the beginning of the 20th century in regards to the ability to access the right to vote, where you had from the beginning that we only want certain people to vote, certain people to access all the full benefits of citizenship, and you think you have that moment with the passage of the Civil War amendments, and then it's gone in less than 20 years. And then you're having this fight from the Civil War amendments. Although we have these constitutional amendments, the ability for Black people to access the right to vote doesn't return until certainly around the passage of the Voting Rights Act. I make the point about my grandmother because she was born in 1919, and the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. Women get the right to vote, and you had hundreds of thousands, I think it was around 800,000 women actually voted in the 2020 presidential election. That's a big number. Guess who was not included in that number? Who still could not access the right to vote, even though you had the 19th Amendment? My grandmother, women who look like me, Black and brown women and men in the South still could not register to vote, even though you had the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. You have the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. You have all these wonderful documents and all these wonderful words, but on the ground, economic terrorism, literacy tests, poll taxes, state laws that were essentially passed to eradicate Black men from accessing the right to vote, and certainly from stopping Black people, Black and brown people, particularly in the South and Southwest, from accessing the right to vote. So that's the landscape for the right to vote. And while those are, certainly historical points, there are many contemporaneous examples we'll also get into, I'm sure.
Thank you for that. Because I think one of the things that's really powerful about your book is that it, as you showed just with your answer just now, is that we can tell this kind of straight line story of unfolding expansion of voting rights towards more and more groups, right? So you have, the civil rights, the Civil War amendments, and then you have women's suffrage in 1920, and then you have the Voting Rights Acts of the 1960s. But part of what you argue in the book, which I think is really important, is to say, no, that's not really the story. The story is these, what we have in the US are these cycles of voter suppression and then an expansion, right? So you have expansion and then suppression, and that's the pattern that continues. And I think it's important to tell the story in that way and not forget, that moment in Reconstruction of expansion followed by suppression. And I think we could, I wonder what you think about, we have voting rights expansion in after the Voting Rights Acts in the 1960s, and whether that's followed by another cycle of suppression. So can you talk about those cycles and about how some of the tactics we're seeing today might mirror some of those used in the past, like poll taxes, grandfather clauses?
Absolutely. So we go from Reconstruction to the Voting Rights Act, but it's not a linear path. It's like losing weight. You think losing weight is you lose 5 pounds. And I've tried, y'all. It's not like that. It's more like this. But in certainly with voter suppression, you have these periods where you have progress, the Civil War amendments, okay, and you have more than 2,000 Black men being elected to offices, and then there's a subtitle in my book called "Free at Last, Not So Fast," and so it was very much free at last, not so fast. Yes, you have this progress, and expanding the electorate, multiracial democracy. It's like no, not so fast, because at base, voting and elections are about power. There are people who are in power who want to keep power. And one way to do that is to determine if they can predetermine who can actually access the right to vote. As part of the state constitutional conventions that happened after the Hayes-Tilden to comply with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, many states developed felon disenfranchisement laws. And y'all have heard of felon disenfranchisement or no? There are certain across the country. It's been called a crazy quilt of laws that if you were previously convicted of a felony, depending on where you live, can determine whether or not you have the right to vote or not. In some states, you can actually vote once you're no longer incarcerated. And there are 2 states where you can vote while you're in prison, while you're in jail. Other states, there are these laws that can determine whether you can access the right to vote, whether you finish your probation or parole, or whether you've paid all of your fines, fees, and restitution. And when Mississippi adopted their felon disenfranchisement law to comply with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, when they had these state constitutional conventions, they said, what crimes do Black men usually commit? Those are the crimes that would be disenfranchising. Timber theft and wife beating were 2 crimes where you could lose your right to vote. Rape and murder were not. I think it says a lot more about the folk in that legislature, but those when they were determining what crimes would be disenfranchising, and they said among those crimes, timber theft and wife beating, because they said those are the crimes that black men commit more often than white men. Therefore, you commit those crimes, you lose your right to vote. But other crimes like rape and murder, you would not. And so you see this line of, state laws certainly from that moment at the turn of the century, certainly to 1965, and then even to today. And where you have literacy tests. I have some firsthand accounts in my book, because you remember the Voting Rights Act was passed less than 59 years ago. So it's still a very young piece of legislation. And I have accounts in the book of persons, like one of my colleagues' mother lived in Montgomery, Alabama. She was a young mother. She graduated from South Carolina State University and then got her master's from Michigan State University in the 1950s. African-American woman, married, 2 young children, went to register to vote in Montgomery, Alabama in the late 1950s. She was asked, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? Her response was around 100. They told her that was wrong. She was not allowed to register to vote. Now, she had more education than the person asking her the question. That was very often the case in the 1950s, 1960s. Dr. Martin Luther King, in his Give Us the Ballot speech in 1955, shortly after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, said that there were all types of conniving methods that were being used to essentially ensure that Black people would not have the right to vote, much like after Reconstruction, certainly literacy tests, poll taxes, where you would have to pay a fee at one point of the year, but then you have to bring that receipt in order to cast your ballot for the election. So oftentimes people are like, well, at that time I think it amounted to like $11.50 in our monies, but people were like, I don't want to have to. First of all, I don't remember where I put the receipt. I think I paid my poll tax. I don't have. So ways in which they could essentially determine who gets to access the right to vote. So poll taxes, literacy tests, violence. We know that Medgar Evers was shot in the driveway of his home for registering people to vote. And certainly you have Bloody Sunday on March 7th, 1965, where Congressman John Lewis and Reverend Hosea Williams were leading people across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, and were beaten for trying to highlight the fact that although Selma, Alabama was a majority African-American city, less than 5% of their Black residents were registered to vote. Less than 5%. Because of literacy tests, terror, and other disenfranchising methods that were in place. So you get the Voting Rights Act signed, and you have President Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1965 saying that it's needed, and that all these conniving methods that Dr. Martin Luther King had spoken about certainly a decade before were preventing Blacks from registering. In places like the state of Mississippi, less than 10% of African Americans in the state of Mississippi were registered to vote. Less than 10%. It was actually 6.7%, whereas compared to 69.3% of whites of the eligible persons who were eligible to register were not registered, not because they didn't want to, but because they had all of these impediments to registering to vote. And those were by law, right? And so we have to talk about some of the role that the law played in ensuring that Black people would not have, Black and brown people across the South and Southwest would not have the right to vote. There was a literacy test in the state of New York for persons who had migrated from Puerto Rico. Another colleague's grandmother showed me her showed me had it wasn't the receipt that demonstrated that she could actually that she had passed the literacy test in the state of New York as someone who had migrated from Puerto Rico, and that she would be allowed to vote. And this is in the 1960s. So what's common throughout is who's being excluded, right? What methods are being used to exclude persons, whether you're calling it a poll tax from the 1950s, 1960s, or early 1900s, or if you're calling it a restrictive voter ID, which requires you to provide, you have to have money to buy a birth certificate. You have to have money to have, I don't know many, how many of you know someone who doesn't have a passport? How about a military ID? Right, anybody who doesn't have a driver's license? Right, so in some states, what I call restrictive voter ID, today, you have to have one of those 3 or 4 pieces of identification in order to access the right to vote. And certainly one of the arguments that's been made is, although we have those constitutional amendments, and we have the Voting Rights Act, which exponentially expanded access to the right to vote even shortly after. We're talking about 5 to 10 years after the Voting Rights Act, and how Black registration and elected officials, certainly Black and brown elected officials, right, were increased exponentially after the Voting Rights Act. Although we certainly have that, we saw, particularly around the election of Barack Obama, after the election of Barack Obama, we saw free at last, not so fast. And then again in 2020, it's like, oh, wait a minute, you did what? You were able to elect. Okay, so we need to shut this down. We need to have more restrictive laws passed to make it harder for people to vote. And certainly when we saw the voter ID laws in the early 2000s, the impact was primarily on people of color, women, elderly people, and young people, right? In places like Texas, you could use your driver's license, passport, military ID, or your gun license to register to vote, but you could not use your University of Texas at Austin student ID. Can't use your student ID, but you can use your gun license. Right? Who has it? Who do you know who has that kind of documentation? There are people who have that kind of documentation more so than other people. And certainly when I was 2006, when I was at the Department of Justice, state of Georgia wanted a voter ID, a restricted voter ID, where it was driver's license, passport, military ID, or some state issued identification. They knew when they passed the legislation that around 25% of African Americans in the state of Georgia did not own a car. So if you know 25% of African Americans don't own a car, why would you make a driver's license the one piece, one of the many? Because the driver's license would be the most common piece of identification, right? If you're talking about a driver's license, military ID, passport, but 25% don't have a car, so they probably don't have a driver's license. So how are they supposed to access the right to vote? You can, but it's going to be much harder for that group than for others. And so certainly one of the things that we've seen is that we do have these cycles where you have periods of progress, and you have these where you get, like for example, in 2020 you had around 65% of registered persons actually voted. Folk were applauding. That's awful. It's horrible. 65%. That means 35% of people stayed home and didn't even decide that voting wasn't important. We're praying for that this time. Okay, we get about 60% of people to actually care enough to actually get out and cast the ballot. But after that, because you had that high number, you saw a lot of restrictive and suppressive legislation across the country that was meant to make it harder. Although we had, no excuse absentee balloting, anybody could get an absentee ballot. When it was old white people asking for absentee ballots, it wasn't a problem. When they made it available and let everyone else know, oh, wait a minute, we have absentee ballots. You don't even have to go to the polls. Because during the pandemic, they were like, I don't even want to go to the polls. I don't want to touch anything. And Secretary of States and election offices just mailed out absentee ballots. And they said, free at last, not so fast. We are not going to make this easy for you. Right, and so now we have more restrictive absentee balloting. They, things like souls to the polls. If you're in the South on Sundays, after church, African American congregations would load up the church bus and go to early voting. Places like Georgia and Alabama said, no early voting on Sunday. Go any other day, but we're cutting out early voting on Sunday. And why do they say, oh, it costs too much? But it doesn't cost too much on Saturday, doesn't cost too much on Friday. But because a certain group was using this that day in particular more so than others, we're not doing it. So one of the reasons I wrote the book was like, it's obvious to me. So I wanted to just like hear the facts. You can arrive at your own conclusions, but here's some things, and we keep hearing the same sound bites. It's fraud, election integrity, but then there's no fraud. Election had the safest elections that we've ever had in the history of the world, but we need these restrictions, but we only need these restrictions that tend to burden some voters more so than others. So there are definitely these cycles that continue to occur. And we're 60. I use the Voting Rights Act as a marker, and where we are because we're and where we're going, and we're 60 years in. And so my prayer is that we can end this cycle of voter suppression instead of having to go another 40 years of enduring certainly these kind of ups and downs, and these are the suppressive measures, but it will definitely take work.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that's really interesting is the way in which, like you said, it's very targeted. Mm-hmm. So, for college students, there was a story in the news recently about college students voting absentee in mm-hmm. Wisconsin who were getting these texts telling them that it was illegal for them to vote, which was not true. Mm-hmm. But it was an attempt to scare them from exercising the right. So I want to turn to asking about, we know there are all these attempts at restricting voting rights, but there are places where states are trying, and activists are trying to force states to expand voting access. And Rhode Island, for example, they passed the Let Rhode Island Vote Act in 2022 that expanded voter access, including the option of no excuse mail ballots, and has same-day voter registration for presidential, but not state, local, or other federal elections. So what are some models of positive policies that you see being implemented to expand voting rights and potentially end the cycle? Yeah.
Well, we certainly we are seeing there is some good news, right? And I think the good news is around certainly has to do a lot with people power and the ability of grassroots organizations to do the work on the ground. For example, an organization in Georgia, the New Georgia Project, has registered more than 50,000 new voters, right? And so just doing that work on the ground has an impact certainly on the legislature as well. And in Georgia, you need a lot of help with the legislature, and so hopefully those new registrants will actually turn out, and you remember in Georgia, the race was won by about 11,000 votes. So if you registered 50,000 new people, hopefully that can certainly have an impact on elections. But we have seen certainly legislatures to do some places have maintained things like no excuse absentee balloting, which means in some places like Texas, I'm sorry, Madison, some places, like Texas, where you have to be over 60 in order to request an absentee ballot. In places where it's certainly making it hard. In places like Pennsylvania, they have an envelope, and you have to put a second envelope inside the first envelope and seal it, and you have to write your name exactly across. Y'all are shaking your heads. Thank you. Across, So there were lawsuits like, well, if the second envelope isn't inside the first envelope, then don't count the vote. Like, for real? Really? Is that where we are? Right. So those kinds of things. But places that have made it easier to actually request and cast absentee ballots that's certainly good things that are happening in certain states. Places that are expanding early voting, like in the state of Virginia, they've been early voting for about a month now. Right, so the expanding early voting. In Maryland, our early voting starts on the 24th and only lasts like 5 or 6 days. So you got to get in where you got to get it in, right? But in places like Virginia, where they have at least 4 weeks of early voting, and there are other places across the country that certainly expanded early voting. Because one thing I think the message that has to get out is that the election ends November 5th. But the election is actually going on right now. And in some states has been going on for more than a month. So the fact that we have more options, there are states that are providing more options and certainly making it easier for persons to actually access the right to vote. And there are places like Minnesota in regards to felon restoration, where more than 25,000 persons got their right to vote restored with the stroke of a pen. By the governor, because when we talk about felon disenfranchisement, I think when people think about persons who are convicted of felonies, what do you think about? Rapists and murderers? Places like Florida, you could lose your right to vote for releasing a helium balloon. The legislature gets to decide what crimes are disenfranchising. So, if it's a certain class of a felony and it's on the list, you just lost your right to vote, right? And so so in places where, in Virginia as well, where certainly prior to this Youngkin administration, you had a governor who restored the right to vote to tens of thousands of persons, again, with the stroke of a pen. So how people get their right to vote restored and getting, and just think about, we talked about, the New Georgia Project registering 50,000 people. But if you could you live in a state like Tennessee, which is horrible on disenfranchisement, but in places like, Minnesota, where you get 25,000 new registrants just because they get their right to vote restored. So those kinds of things are happening across the country, and certainly I'm an advocate of that. We need more of that. One of the things with felon disenfranchisement, I think I told you I work with the Campaign Legal Center. We have a Restore Your Vote program, which is phenomenal, because the biggest issue for a lot of people who have been convicted of a felony is that they think that because they've been convicted of a felony that they cannot vote. But many of them can. Hundreds of thousands of them can because of where they actually live, right? It depends on where you live. Like if you live in Maryland, once you're no longer incarcerated, you can vote, right? But if you, go to Florida, then you have to pay all of your fees, fines, and restitution and complete all those other things. But you can go to, I think it's restoreyourvote.org. So if you have family members who may have been convicted of a felony, and I told you the kinds of felony people, things that people you can have a felony conviction for not paying your is your registration, or has something to do with your driving with a suspended license. If you're driving with a suspended license in Florida, you could lose your right to vote. So there are things, we're not talking about heinous crimes here. We're talking about things that at one time in Alabama, if y'all don't write checks. Okay, I'm talking to the older people. At one time, well, let's say if you had overdraft, if you had an overdraft twice, thank you. If you bounce a check in excess of $100, you could lose at one time in Alabama, you could lose your right to vote if you bounced your check in excess of $100. Right. So just think about if you overdrafted twice, you could lose your right to vote. Sometimes those are the kinds of things that these states have decided, much like, back in the day, as we would say, what kinds of crimes would this community commit more often than others? Those are the ones that would be disenfranchising. So you see those, certainly the kinds of things that happen. So if you know someone, may even have a relative, tell them to go to restoreyourvote.org so they can determine whether or not they actually have the right to vote, because in most cases I think they would.
So one of the things that's striking to me about some of these contemporary voter suppression tactics is that they're aimed at people of color, but they have this kind of class dimension. So they could potentially also affect,
Yes, absolutely.
poor white people who get caught up in some of them. So that brings me to the question of, what are we've talked a lot about race and how that has shaped access to voting. But obviously gender was also a major obstacle until the 19th Amendment. And we're in a current presidential election where you might, have basically, the rollback of reproductive rights is a big issue, and the possibility of the first female president. So what are your thoughts about, what's at stake in terms of gender in this election, and how it's playing out in terms of questions of voter suppression?
Absolutely. Gender and class. You mentioned poor voters. Very much from the outset, it was, if you didn't own property, you couldn't vote, right? That's a class issue. And today, certainly with the voter ID, like you have to, saying you need a driver's license, a passport, these other things, you have to have your birth certificate. I have a friend who lives in Georgia. Her father has moved in with them. He's elderly. He moved from Louisiana. And so I had my class do a whole hypothetical. Where can he register and where can he vote? So it was like, okay, can he register in Georgia? Well, he's in Louisiana now. He doesn't have his birth certificate. So he couldn't register in Georgia because he didn't have a birth certificate, because he needed to get the identification, and to do that you had to have that underlying. So it's a financial, it's elderly people, it's my grandmother didn't have a birth certificate, so how was she supposed to register to vote? So all of those, and certainly by the time she was 99, no longer had a driver's license. My friend's father has a driver's license, but it's expired. Can't use an expired driver. So at every obstacle is like, so how is he supposed to register to vote? Can he get an absentee ballot from the state of Louisiana? Because are they going to forward it to his Georgia address? All of those things. And so in regards to gender, it's those voter ID. We found that voter ID really impacts women, and also trans people. Right, because you got to have documents that have your original name on it, but that's not. Maybe you're not registering. When I registered, I had to have my marriage certificate. I had to have my birth certificate. I had to have all these explanations of why my name was my name. Right, and so you see that impacting certainly not only elderly people with the ability to get these underlying documents, women, trans people, and so it certainly has an impact. We're seeing certainly in this election with a multiracial female at the top of the ticket. You all have noticed everything in the news, even from the comment about whether she was actually Black or did she turn Black. That's a whole critical race theory conversation, right? All the feminists, the way the media speaks about the female candidate versus the male candidate, and then the focus on female voters, right? Which certainly with reproductive health. One of the things I talk about in the book is I told you I'm the daughter and granddaughter of Baptist preachers, and I started my so read the preface. You got to read my introduction. Don't just skip. Don't got to read every word. But in the introduction, I say that there's been a verse that has always perplexed me. It's having the power. It's having. What is it having? But it's denying the power thereof. It's having. Anyways, it said we have this power, but we really don't realize how much power we have. And I certainly think for women, people of color, disabled, I think we don't realize the power that we have. And the focus is on women now, but I think one of the things you talked about in your class is kind of redirection, right? That we need to control what's being said about us, and we need to say, well, you're thinking about that. They're thinking about differently, right? They're thinking about, well, in 2016, white women didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. They're like, oh, we can't do that again. But think about, wait a minute, we have actually more women in these United States who can vote and who will vote than men, percentage-wise. So how about realizing that power and using it to make real change, right? For deciding, what kinds of laws will get passed, who gets elected, those kinds. So I think there's a focus on women, but I think, it's, building these coalitions and trying to have, everybody dance to the same beat of the drummer instead of this focus on fear. Mm-hmm. I think we all kind of focused on fear. It's like, oh God, we can't have him. Right. And I don't think that's, instead of, I think we need to kind of realize the power that we have, that we can decide this. We can do this. It can be done. And we can kind of redirect our focus to ensure that it gets done, because it can't. And this idea of hope and joy and all these other things, that's fine. I'm not here to campaign for anybody. I'm just saying, I think that we need to think, I talk about, I think I told you, I talk about my grandmother, and when people, talking about this focus on fear, one of the things that I really remind people about is that, I think I've seen this, there's a t-shirt that said, we're the hope, the hope of my ancestors, so the hope of my ancestors. Say it again. My ancestors' wildest dreams. My grandmother, when I was, and I have a point here, but my grandmother was a domestic. And so I had graduated from law school, and I was staying overnight with her, and we had to go clean up Miss Polly's house. So I went to Miss Polly's house, and she said, "It's my grandbaby. She just graduated from college," and she said she's going to law school in New York City. And Miss Polly was like, "Oh, hey," I was just like, "Ooh, Jesus!" I was like, it took everything I had, I was just like, Miss Polly. My grandmother continued to work for Miss Polly just because that's what she wanted to do, because they were sharecroppers and worked for Miss Polly. But my grandmother didn't know that someone who graduated from law school could also be a judge. She was like, you can be a judge with that? It's like, yes, ma'am, I can be a judge with that. So this wildest dreams thing, it's like, I don't think we imagine enough. It's like we just like, let's just get her elected. I'm just like, that's here. What else do you want? And realizing that can actually happen, because one of the things that the reason we have these, because I tell people, I wrote a whole book about voter suppression, but I have a lot of hope. The reason we have these suppressive laws is because we keep winning. So think about it. We keep winning. So as long as we keep winning and they keep saying, oh, we can't do that. We can't have that. So what kinds of things can we put in place to stop this? But every turn is, okay, well, what do we have to do? Well, let's do that. But I think we need to, instead of thinking about, okay, well, let's just do this thing. Let's just win this election. What else do we want? What else can we do? How can we, I know that's your centers and that's the other things, but I think that we, in particular here at this institution and others, I think we have to start challenging our students and ourselves to think higher and bigger, because we are the wildest dreams. Because my grandmother never didn't know that a lawyer could be a judge. And here I am, I went to NYU, and I went all the way to New York City, right? And so to know that can happen. And so we have more money, more education, more, just fill in the blank. In this room, we have more of those things than my grandmother had. We have more of those things than my mother and father had. And so since we have more of those things, guess what? There's more that we can do. We can do more than just access the right to vote, right? And it's a shame that we're still having to fight for that, but that's okay. We're going to win, right? So we'll just keep fighting for that. I'll keep writing about it. We'll keep doing it. We'll keep bringing these cases, and we'll keep winning. And it's harder to win now than certainly it was even 10 years ago. But we can't get discouraged. You have to keep fighting so that women, elderly, LGBTQIA plus, all these communities can realize the dreams of our ancestors. And that's my sermon. And I just get an amen. Amen. Okay. Thanks. I'll get this. That's my daughter told me supposed to do this right here. And say purr. Okay.
So I think we're going to transition to giving you all a chance to ask questions. And while you warm up, please come up to the mics to ask your questions. And we might have some online questions as well, so you can submit those, and we will read those as well. But while we're waiting for people to formulate their questions, I wanted to ask you, you started to talk about this in your previous answer, which is, right, voting is important, but it's not the only form of political participation. Right. So what can we do beyond voting?
A lot. And some of y'all were trying to do that this weekend. Apparently. That's right. Organize. There's lots of ways of participating, and I think it's I don't want us to see Election Day as the end. It's really the beginning. Democracy is 24/7, 365. You have to make people represent you. Right, so it is. I had my daughter writing letters to her congressperson when they were talking about defunding PBS. She wrote a letter to a congressperson, and they wrote her back. Right, she was like, "Oh, they're gonna get rid of Sesame Street." I'm like, "No, baby, they won't." Elmo's still around, right? And you can thank Lauren Kristen Daniels for that. But certainly agitate, and making sure that. You're only heard when you speak. So you have to speak. You have to say the thing, know what you want, and build coalitions. Don't burn bridges. Build coalitions. Y'all can disagree on some things and agree on the one very most important thing, right? That democracy has to continue, or whatever that is, and work together for that. Work for that thing. So. There's power. I certainly believe in people power, but it's I wholeheartedly believe in people power. So I believe in your whatever institutions, your church, mosque, synagogue, religious institutions. I think I don't think particularly those institutions realize the power that they have. I go to a mega church, and that's certainly some things I'm like, I don't want my pastor talking about. But in regards to having a captive audience and having the ability to say there's some like-minded, there's some issues that we can all agree on. I want him to tell people to go vote, that it's important to register. You don't have to say who to vote for. Register, vote. It's important, right? And so, while you're certainly registering and voting, I want y'all to early vote and then work at the polls and work to get out people, even if you all can go to Pennsylvania or other places, New York or other places, to ensure that the right to vote is actualized. But I think certainly being a part of organizations, is very important. And also, I tell people to do a few things. I say educate, legislate, litigate, participate. Okay, so say educate, legislate, litigate, participate. So I need you to educate yourselves about what, not just what's on the ballot, but when is the legislative session? What kinds of laws are they proposing? You know, what state? Who are the folk who are advocating for things that you believe in, right? So you have to educate yourselves about, you know, who. You know, I usually put people on the spot. Who is your state representative? Folk don't know. School board member. People don't know. That's where all the banned books are coming from the school board, right? It's like, so we just kind of we've taken all these things for granted, but you got to educate yourselves on, it's a whole civic education. So educate and legislative, certainly understanding, what's the legislative, when is the legislative session? What kinds of things are being done? Who do you see as someone who represents you? Litigate, partnering with and working with organizations that are challenging certainly these suppressive laws and others, right? There are organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the ACLU, Advancement Project, Southern Poverty Law Center, Demos, and others, Pearl Deaf, right? That are all doing the work. And so partnering with those organizations or giving them money is also a thing you can, and organizations like New Georgia Project and others that are doing the work. And then finally participate. You know, go ahead and early vote so you can actually work for the candidates you want to work for, help get out the vote, work with your organizations to ensure that others have the ability to get out the vote, but educate, legislate, litigate, and participate. So those are all certainly things I encourage people to do, because I think it's important that we know that it's not just, oh my God, it's not all doom and gloom. We have work to do. And we have, so I know y'all don't remember. Who remembers the $6 Million Man? I know who's gonna raise their hands. Y'all gotta go back and watch these old throwback television shows. There was a show called The $6 Million Man, and when the show started, they would say, "We have the technology. We can rebuild him." So they essentially just gave him some old parts and rebuilt him, and he could run 60 miles an hour. He can do all these things. He was a superhero. So with democracy, we have the technology. We can rebuild it. So let's go about the work. Oh, purr. So we can. So let's go about and go out and get the work done.
That's, I think, words to live by. Democracy's 24/7,
365
days,
24/7,
and we have the
365.
tools.